It's one of those stories that makes you question everything you think you know about innocence. San Diego, sunny, peaceful, postcard perfect. A city where the surf is calm, the air smells of salt, and the worst thing most people fear is traffic on I-5. Yet beneath that warm California glow, something unimaginably dark was taking shape. At just 13 years old, Lance Thompson wasn't dreaming about baseball or summer camp. He was plotting the execution of a police officer, not out of rage, not out of revenge, but for thrill. He believed his age made him untouchable, that the world would never see a child as capable of evil. But when the truth surfaced, through a single chilling clue, it exposed a monster hidden behind an innocent face, and a community forced to confront a horrifying question. How young can true evil begin? If stories like this leave you questioning the line between innocence and darkness, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because we uncover the cases most people can't forget but wish they could. Your support helps bring more real stories of justice, deception, and human psychology to light. San Diego, a city painted in sun and salt, where the horizon melts into the Pacific and every evening feels like an invitation to peace. It's the kind of place where darkness feels impossible, where the idea of evil seems foreign, almost absurd. But sometimes, evil doesn't arrive with a storm. It grows quietly under blue skies, behind the windows of ordinary homes. And in one of those homes, at the end of a neat suburban cul-de-sac, a 13-year-old boy named Lance Thompson was learning how to hide the unimaginable behind a practiced smile. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wasn't the loud kid, the troublemaker, or the loner people whispered about. He was polite enough to adults, quiet enough in class, and forgettable enough to blend into the background. His teachers called him smart but detached. His parents described him as reserved, and neighbors waved at him without really noticing him. To most people, Lance Thompson was the kind of child you don't remember seeing, even when you pass him every day. That invisibility suited him perfectly. It was his shield, the first part of a carefully crafted illusion that let him move through the world unseen, while something dark took root beneath the surface. He wasn't born into hardship or chaos. There was no abusive parent or traumatic childhood memory that people could later point to and say, "There, that's where it all began." His home life was stable, comfortable even. A father who worked long hours but provided well. A mother who packed lunches and asked about homework. There were birthday cakes, movie nights, family photos on the mantle, everything that fits the mold of normal. And yet, behind Lance's calm eyes, normalcy had already started to feel suffocating. He saw routine not as comfort, but as confinement. He watched his parents move through their predictable rhythms and felt nothing but contempt for their simplicity. The laughter at the dinner table sounded hollow to him. The small talk about school felt like static. By 12, he had learned to fake the right responses. A nod, a smile, a quick, "Yeah, sure." But they were empty gestures, rehearsed performances for people who couldn't see past the act. His real world existed online. Late at night, while the rest of his family slept, Lance scrolled through the darker corners of the internet. Forums filled with anonymous users who shared his fascination with control, violence, and the absence of remorse. He didn't just stumble into them, he sought them out, as if drawn by an invisible thread. What began as curiosity, reading about famous crimes, watching documentaries about serial killers, slowly turned into obsession. He began studying the psychology behind cruelty, the way other kids studied for math tests. The concept of empathy fascinated him precisely because he couldn't feel it. He watched videos of tragedies, not to understand the victims, but to observe reactions. The way voices broke, the way faces collapsed in grief. It was research. And the more he observed, the more detached he became. At school, this detachment started to show in subtle ways. When a classmate tripped and fell, he didn't help them up. He simply stared, his head tilted, as though cataloging the moment. When a teacher mentioned morality in a discussion about literature, Lance's lips curved in a slight, amused smile, as if the word itself were a punchline. He never caused trouble openly, but those who looked closely could sense it, that faint, eerie stillness behind his eyes. His friends, or what passed for them, found him odd but intriguing. "Lance doesn't care about anything," one of them once said. "It's kinda cool." That was the thing about indifference. People often mistake it for confidence. The turning point came when Lance met Caleb Foster. Caleb was older, 15, reckless and angry, the kind of teenager who burned with resentment at everything. His divorced parents, the teachers who didn't get him, the world that seemed too boring to matter. The two boys met in detention, an almost cinematic accident that felt like fate. Caleb had been caught hacking into a school computer system for fun. Lance was there for carving a cryptic message into another student's locker. "We're all just experiments." That phrase, eerie, detached, almost philosophical, was Lance in a sentence. And Caleb, who had been looking for something to rebel against, saw in him not weirdness but brilliance. They began talking. First about video games, then about how fake people were, then about the illusion of law and order. To most adults, it would have sounded like teenage posturing. To Lance, it was a blueprint. The friendship became a feedback loop of darkness. Caleb craved attention, Lance craved control. Together, they created an echo chamber where cruelty sounded like intellect and rebellion felt like power. Their conversations grew bolder. They talked about pranks that would shake people up, then experiments that could test fear. Caleb joked about doing something big one day, something that would make headlines. Lance didn't laugh. He just looked at him and said quietly, "Headlines fade. Legends don't." From that moment, Caleb wasn't the leader anymore. He was the follower, orbiting the gravitational pull of Lance's calm, terrifying conviction. Around that same time, Lance's digital footprint darkened further. His search history shifted from curiosity to logistics: how to acquire a weapon, how to make a fake emergency call, how long it took for police to respond to specific areas of the city. He downloaded police scanner apps, mapped response routes, even timed how long it took sirens to echo from certain directions. It was all meticulous, clinical, as if he were preparing for a science fair rather than a murder. In his private journal, which would later become the key evidence against him, he wrote, "Fear is the only real emotion left. Everything else is performance." At home, his parents saw only moodiness, the quiet teenager who locked his door and preferred screens over family time. They chalked it up to adolescence, never realizing their son wasn't pulling away to find independence. He was retreating into darkness. The strangest thing was how normal he remained on the surface. He still did his homework, still played video games, still smiled politely when his mother called him down for dinner. There was no screaming, no rebellion, no visible break, just silence, the calmest kind of danger. One afternoon, his mother recalled later, she found him in the backyard staring at an anthill. "What are you doing, honey?" she asked. Lance didn't look up. "Watching them," he said. "They don't even know I could wipe them out right now." She laughed, thinking it was childish humor. But the expression on his face, cold, detached, fascinated, would come back to her years later, hauntingly clear. In the months that followed, Lance's fascination with death became less abstract. He collected stories of unsolved murders, quoting details with eerie precision. He played violent video games not for entertainment, but as simulations, often pausing mid-game to analyze the AI's reaction to damage. "It's not the killing that's interesting," he once wrote in a message to Caleb, "it's the reaction to it." To him, life and death weren't moral questions. They were data points, By early summer, the line between imagination and intent had vanished completely. The mission, as he and Caleb called it, had been planned to the smallest detail. Their target wasn't chosen randomly. They didn't want fame. They wanted symbolism. Lance decided the victim should be a police officer, someone who represented everything he despised: rules, control, the illusion of authority. The idea of destroying that symbol thrilled him in a way nothing else could. "He's not a person," Lance told Caleb. "He's a uniform, an idea. And ideas are the only things worth breaking." Caleb, insecure and easily manipulated, agreed. In his journal, Lance drew sketches of what would later be identified as the abandoned warehouse where the ambush would occur. He labeled angles, escape routes, light sources. It looked more like a tactical plan than anything a child should be capable of creating. And yet, this was the part that terrified investigators the most: the precision, the patience, the absence of emotion in his notes. There was no rage, no impulsivity, just calm, clinical intent. Still, through all of this, Lance remained the perfect son. He ate dinner with his family, watched movies with his parents, even joked with his little sister. But the laughter was hollow, a mimicry of normalcy. He didn't feel joy, only the satisfaction of performing it convincingly. Every smile was practice for deception. Every routine was camouflage. And that's what made him so dangerous. Monsters that roar are easy to spot. The ones that whisper, the ones that smile, they blend in until it's too late. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere, but who would have believed them? How do you look at a 13-year-old and see a killer? His classmates remembered him as quiet, maybe a little weird. His teachers said he was too smart for his age. Nobody ever used the word evil. But that's exactly what he was becoming. And not by accident, but by design. He studied it. He crafted it. And in his mind, he had already rehearsed the aftermath, the headlines, the trial, the fascination he believed he would inspire. He saw himself as untouchable, protected by the very thing that defined him: his age. In one journal entry, scrawled in precise handwriting, he wrote, "Kids don't go to prison. They go to programs. The system will try to fix me. They can't fix what isn't broken." That line, later read aloud in court, sent chills through everyone who heard it, because Lance truly believed it. By the time summer arrived, his transformation was complete. He was no longer pretending to be ordinary. He was performing it. Every word, every gesture, every blank stare was part of an act. The countdown had already started, silent and invisible, ticking beneath the calm rhythm of suburban life. His parents planned barbecues. His friends planned summer trips. And Lance, he planned a murder. He believed he could outsmart the world. He believed that being 13 made him immortal in the eyes of the law. And for a brief, horrifying moment, it almost seemed like he was right. But what he didn't understand was that evil, no matter how young, no matter how careful, always leaves traces. A mistake, a fragment, a heartbeat in the wrong place. And for Lance Thompson, that mistake was waiting just beyond the edge of his plan, like a shadow he couldn't see creeping closer with every passing day. He thought he could get away, but every story of evil eventually meets the moment when evil looks back and realizes it's been seen. Every crime has a spark, that one fateful collision of lives that turns curiosity into conspiracy. For Lance Thompson, that spark came in the form of Caleb Foster, a boy 2 years older but just as untethered from empathy. Caleb was the kind of teenager people noticed for all the wrong reasons. He was tall, sharp-featured, with the permanent slouch of someone who'd already given up on the world. His clothes were always wrinkled, his backpack half unzipped, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had learned early on that life didn't care about fairness. Caleb had grown up watching his parents fight over everything: money, loyalty, love. His father had left without saying goodbye. His mother was there physically, but emotionally long gone, numbed by exhaustion and resentment. So Caleb drifted, a boy untethered, searching for something to anchor him. He didn't find stability. He found Lance. Their meeting seemed almost ordinary, almost laughably mundane in hindsight. Two boys sitting in the same detention room, one punished for hacking into a teacher's computer system just to prove he could, the other for scrawling something cryptic on a locker. But something invisible passed between them that day. Recognition, maybe. Not friendship in the usual sense, but a mutual understanding between two souls who didn't quite fit into the moral architecture of the world around them. They were both intelligent beyond their years, but it was a cold intelligence, analytical and detached. They didn't talk about sports or girls or schoolwork. They talked about people, how predictable they were, how easily they could be manipulated, how the world was just a game full of players who didn't realize they were being played. And that conversation, born in boredom and arrogance, was the first step toward something catastrophic. At first, it was just talk. Dark, hypothetical conversations whispered in the corners of the schoolyard or shared through late-night text threads full of nihilistic jokes. They laughed at the idea of chaos, called themselves observers of the weak, and treated morality like a childish superstition. But with Lance, the line between fantasy and reality didn't exist. He began taking notes, sketching ideas in the back of his notebook, treating their talks not as rebellion, but as planning. Caleb thought he was joking, until the day Lance looked at him and said, in a voice too calm to be casual, "What if we didn't just talk about it?" From that moment, the tone of their friendship shifted. It stopped being about rebellion and became about purpose. They were no longer just two kids angry at the world. They were two minds feeding off each other's darkness. Caleb's home life only deepened that descent. Nights spent alone, wandering through forums where pain and apathy were currency. He'd show Lance the videos he found online, clips of fights, cruelty, tragedy, and they'd watch them together, not with horror, but fascination. "You notice how nobody really helps?" Lance would say quietly. "They all just stare, like they want to see how far it goes." Caleb would nod, half smiling, not realizing that Lance wasn't just observing humanity, he was studying it. Piece by piece, he was constructing a theory that empathy was weakness, that the only real power came from deciding who mattered and who didn't. And slowly, Caleb began to believe it too. It was intoxicating, that feeling of superiority, of seeing through the world's illusions. Lance made him feel part of something bigger, something dangerous, yes, but purposeful. Together they began crafting their own distorted philosophy, one where morality was a joke and control was the only truth worth chasing. It was Lance who coined the term mission. The word sounded clinical, detached, the perfect disguise for what it really was. In his mind, they weren't plotting a murder, they were conducting an experiment. They were going to test the boundaries of consequence, push the limits of what society would tolerate, and see how long they could stand outside the moral framework that governed everyone else. Caleb, who had spent his life being ignored, finally felt seen. Lance, who craved control, finally had an audience. The balance between them was never equal. Lance was the architect, Caleb the instrument, and while Caleb occasionally hesitated, it only took a few well-placed words to bring him back in line. Lance had a way of making cruelty sound rational. "It's not about hate," he'd say. "It's about proving that we're not like them. We're free." The first draft of their mission was surprisingly methodical. They spent hours talking through potential targets, though that word at first meant nothing more than symbols to them, people who represented authority, control, or hypocrisy. Teachers, security guards, police. The list was theoretical, but each name carried an undercurrent of excitement for Lance, like picking pieces on a chessboard. And as the weeks passed, theory hardened into intent. They started practicing scenarios, how to lure someone, how to move unseen, how to manipulate responses. It was both absurd and horrifying. Two teenagers, one barely in his teens, rehearsing a killing like a school project. But Lance approached it with the same calm focus he'd shown in class, the same quiet precision that once made teachers call him gifted. Only now that gift had found its way into darkness. What's chilling about this part of the story is how ordinary everything around them remained. During those same weeks, Lance's parents were planning a family vacation to Lake Tahoe. Caleb was helping his mom carry groceries, occasionally even joking around like a normal 15-year-old. To anyone looking in, there was no sign of what was brewing. That's what makes adolescent evil so deceptive. It wears the face of youth. It looks harmless. It hides behind algebra homework and fast food wrappers and the illusion that children are incapable of real darkness. But in Lance and Caleb's world, innocence had already died. They had built a bubble where empathy didn't exist, where murder was not a crime, but an act of creation. Late one night, they sat on the roof of Caleb's house, the sky above them heavy with stars, the city lights stretching endlessly in every direction. Caleb tossed a rock, watched it bounce off the neighbor's fence, and said half-jokingly, "You think anyone would even notice if we disappeared?" Lance didn't look up. "No," he said softly. "But they'll notice when we make someone else disappear." There was no smile, no trace of humor. Just that eerie calm again, the kind that made Caleb's stomach tighten even as he nodded in agreement. That was the night the pact was sealed, not with a handshake or blood or any theatrical gesture, just a shared silence, a mutual decision that the line between thought and action no longer existed. In the days that followed, the plan began to crystallize. Lance wanted their act to be symbolic, to mean something beyond the violence itself. A police officer, he decided, would be perfect, a living embodiment of the control he despised. To him, it wasn't about killing a man, it was about dismantling an idea. And once he explained it, even Caleb couldn't help but feel a dark fascination with the notion. They would stage a fake emergency call, draw a single officer to an isolated location, and ambush him. Lance described it like an experiment, calculating every step, the timing, the weapon, the escape. His tone was calm, detached, eerily adult. Caleb, meanwhile, oscillated between excitement and dread. But every time fear crept in, Lance knew exactly how to snuff it out. "You think the world cares about you?" he'd whisper. "This is the only way to prove we exist. Otherwise, you're just another invisible person waiting to die." Those words hit Caleb in the softest, most desperate part of his being, because deep down, that's all he wanted, to matter, even if it meant becoming infamous. As the plan took form, Lance's confidence grew into arrogance. He believed himself invincible, convinced that his youth was armor. "They won't know what to do with us," he said once, smiling faintly. "We're too young to hate, too clever to blame." It was that belief, that chilling mix of intelligence and immaturity, that made him so dangerous. Caleb, for all his recklessness, still had traces of humanity left. There were nights he'd lie awake, haunted by flashes of doubt, by the thought of the victim's face. But Lance slept soundly. He didn't dream. He didn't worry. He simply waited for the right night to arrive. And while the rest of the world carried on, parents kissing their kids goodnight, officers starting quiet evening shifts, the city of San Diego breathing under its soft ocean breeze, two boys sat in a bedroom lit only by the glow of a computer screen, plotting something that would stain that peace forever. They talked about legacy, about fear, about power. They spoke with the vocabulary of philosophers and the morality of predators. Lance typed instructions into a document labeled simply Experiment Number 1. Caleb stared at the words on the screen, the reality of it pressing down on him like a weight. "After this," he whispered, "nothing's going to be the same." Lance didn't look up. "That's the point," he said. Outside, the night was still. The city slept, unaware that somewhere, in the mind of a 13-year-old, the countdown to horror had already begun. It was a pact, born not from necessity or vengeance, but from something far more terrifying: curiosity. And once curiosity turns toward destruction, there's no turning back. The sun would rise the next morning, the waves would crash gently on the San Diego shore, and life would look perfectly ordinary. But in the shadows, the mission was already alive, and it was only a matter of time before it demanded its price. It was a Tuesday evening that began like any other in San Diego, the kind of night that carried the scent of salt and sunscreen, when the sky faded from coral pink to the deep indigo of Pacific twilight. The air was soft, the streets calm, and somewhere, music from a beachfront bar drifted lazily into the distance. It was the kind of peace people move to California for. But peace, as the city would soon learn, can be deceptive. Beneath the quiet, two boys were moving like shadows through the outskirts of town, armed with a stolen gun, a burner phone, and a plan that would turn that warm coastal calm into a wound that would never fully heal. The warehouse district near the naval shipyard was the perfect place for their experiment. Abandoned, forgotten, surrounded by chain-link fences and the faint hum of the highway. To anyone else, it was just another empty lot swallowed by the dark. To Lance and Caleb, it was a stage. They had chosen it carefully after weeks of scouting, isolated enough to draw only a single patrol car, accessible enough to slip away without notice. They had rehearsed the timing again and again, Lance timing how long it took for police to respond to calls in that part of the city. Tonight, all the pieces were in place. The weapon, a 9mm handgun stolen from Caleb's mother's boyfriend, was loaded and wrapped in a cloth bag. The burner phone sat on the cracked dashboard of Caleb's car, its screen glowing faintly like an omen. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Lance dialed 911. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, disturbingly steady. He told the operator there was a violent domestic disturbance at an abandoned warehouse near the docks. He described screams, broken glass, a man with a gun. He even added a touch of panic to his voice, enough to make the operator lean forward in her chair, enough to make the call feel real. Then he hung up and smiled. That was it. The trap had been set. "Now we wait," he said quietly, as if they were about to watch a movie rather than commit murder. Caleb swallowed hard, trying to match Lance's calm, but his hands trembled. The thrill that had seemed intoxicating weeks ago now felt like poison. But Lance's eyes, cold, unblinking, anchored him. Backing out wasn't an option anymore. 10 minutes later, headlights appeared at the far end of the lot, slicing through the darkness like a blade. The sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness, followed by the faint crackle of a police radio. Officer Thomas Graham had arrived. He was 42, a husband, a father of two, a man who believed deeply in the idea that good still outweighed evil. He'd been on the force for 15 years, long enough to know danger when he saw it. But nothing in his experience could have prepared him for what was waiting in that empty lot. His cruiser rolled to a stop. The beam of his flashlight cut through the shadows, landing on the warehouse door. He stepped out, one hand resting instinctively on his holster. The air around him felt too still, too heavy, the kind of silence that presses on the skin. From behind a stack of rusted crates, Lance and Caleb watched. Lance's heart didn't race. It slowed. He described the feeling later as clarity. A moment of perfect stillness when everything in the world made sense. To him, this wasn't fear. It was control. "Now," he whispered. Caleb hesitated, then raised the gun. The first shot cracked through the night like a violent echo. Officer Graham turned sharply, his flashlight beam jerking across the asphalt. Before he could even draw his weapon, a second shot rang out, then a third. He fell backward, the sound of his body hitting the ground merging with the metallic clang of his dropped flashlight. The beam rolled sideways, landing on the warehouse wall, painting it with a trembling circle of light that pulsed with each flicker of the cruiser's siren. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, the kind that feels alive, like it's holding its breath. Caleb's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the gun. Lance reached out, steadying him. "It's fine," he said softly, as if calming a friend after a minor accident. Then he walked forward, each step slow, deliberate. The flashing red and blue lights washed over his face, alternating between the color of warning and the color of blood. He looked down at the man on the ground, the man who, minutes ago, had been protecting the city, and tilted his head, studying him like a specimen. There was no triumph in his expression, no visible excitement, just curiosity. Then, without a word, he pulled out his phone and took a photo, and then another, and another. Caleb stared in disbelief. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Lance didn't answer. He just turned the phone toward him for a moment, showing the image on the screen. Officer Graham's body, the patrol car's lights reflecting off the asphalt, the blood pooling beneath the badge. "Proof," Lance said simply. "No one believes what they can't see." He took a final photo, then tucked the phone away. It wasn't enough for him to take a life. He needed to capture it, to freeze the moment, to make it his. Later, investigators would find that photo among dozens of others on a hidden hard drive, his digital trophy room, the archive of a boy who wanted his evil to be remembered. When it was over, they didn't run. That was perhaps the most chilling detail of all. They walked calmly back to the car, their footsteps echoing softly against the concrete. Lance even stopped to wipe a smudge of blood from his sneaker with a napkin he'd brought from home. It wasn't panic that moved him. It was precision. They drove away with the windows down, the cool ocean air rushing in as if to cleanse them. Caleb stared out the window, pale and silent, while Lance leaned back in his seat, humming quietly to the rhythm of the city passing by. Behind them, the lights of the patrol car flickered alone in the darkness, casting an eerie glow over the lifeless figure on the ground. Back at home, San Diego slept peacefully. In the Thompson household, the dishwasher hummed, a television murmured faintly from another room, and a mother checked on her children before going to bed. Lance was already home, sitting at his desk, his face illuminated by the soft blue light of his computer screen. He opened a folder, typed in a password, and uploaded the photos. He named the file Level 1. Then he shut the laptop, brushed his teeth, and went to bed. He slept soundly, not the restless sleep of guilt, but the deep, dreamless rest of someone who felt, at last, in control. It wasn't until early the next morning that Officer Thomas Graham's body was found. When dispatch couldn't reach him for his scheduled check-in, they sent another unit to the location. The scene they discovered was one of pure devastation. A good man's life ended with surgical precision, a police cruiser's lights still flashing weakly in the dawn. Word spread quickly through the department. The murder of an officer wasn't just a crime, it was an assault on their entire family. Within hours, the lot was crawling with investigators, their faces lit by harsh floodlights and disbelief. Yellow tape fluttered in the sea breeze, cutting through the morning fog like a wound across the city's skin. Detective Stephen Carlson, a veteran with 20 years on the force, stood over the scene, his jaw tight, his eyes hollow. He'd seen plenty of death in his career, but something about this felt different. The precision of it, the stillness, the absence of panic. He crouched beside the body, studying the shell casings scattered near the car, the angle of the shots, the clean execution. "This wasn't random," he said quietly to one of the officers. "This was planned." He couldn't have known then just how right he was, or how young the planners would turn out to be. By sunrise, the city was awake to the news. Officer killed in line of duty. The headlines read. Radios played solemn tributes. Flags were lowered, and the people of San Diego mourned a man they didn't know but trusted with their safety. Parents hugged their children a little tighter. Strangers brought flowers to the police station. The city's warmth turned somber, and beneath it all the question lingered. Who could do something like this? And somewhere in the suburbs, the answer was eating cereal at the kitchen table. Lance sat quietly as his mother read the morning news aloud, her voice trembling. "They killed a police officer," she said, horrified. "My God, what kind of monsters?" Lance looked up from his bowl, his expression calm, even sympathetic. "That's awful," he said softly. Then he went back to eating. That moment, that unbearable contrast between innocence and evil, would haunt Detective Carlson for months. Because while the city searched for monsters hiding in the dark, the real one was sitting in plain sight, smiling politely, blending into the rhythm of normal life. The night San Diego lost its peace wasn't just the night an officer was killed. It was the night the illusion of innocence was shattered. The night the world learned that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones still young enough to call home for dinner. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific the next morning, the warehouse district had transformed from a forgotten corner of San Diego into the epicenter of national grief. The yellow tape, the camera flashes, the murmurs of disbelief, all of it unfolded beneath the dull gray sky like a tragedy rehearsed too many times before. But this one was different. This wasn't a drug deal gone wrong or a gang-related ambush. This was a calculated surgical act, a deliberate killing of a police officer in cold blood, the kind of act that made even the most seasoned detectives feel their stomachs turn, the kind of act that carried a message, though no one yet knew what that message was. The warehouse itself stood silent, its metal walls now marked by the chalk outlines and bloodstains that would become part of a grim archive. To the untrained eye, it was just another crime scene. To Detective Stephen Carlson, it was something far more disturbing, the beginning of a story that didn't make sense. Carlson had been with the department long enough to know when a crime told a story, and when it didn't. This one didn't. The evidence seemed wrong in 100 subtle ways. There were no signs of robbery, no defensive wounds, no struggle. The shooter hadn't panicked. The scene was almost too clean. "This was execution," he muttered, crouching near the blood-stained asphalt. "But why here? Why him?" He looked toward the open warehouse door, the morning light spilling in like a weak confession. Inside, the air still smelled faintly of gunpowder and oil. Every sound echoed, the crunch of footsteps, the click of cameras, the low murmur of officers trying to make sense of the senseless. The echoes felt alive, like the building itself remembered what had happened and was trying to whisper it back. The security cameras in the area offered little help. Most were broken or faced away from the lot. The only usable footage came from a camera mounted across the street on a utility pole, which captured a brief glimpse of headlights entering the area, and then nothing. No license plate, no clear faces, just a shadow of movement swallowed by darkness. It was as if the killers had stepped into existence just long enough to pull the trigger, then vanished into the night. But one detail caught Carlson's eye. The angle of the headlights suggested a smaller car, compact, likely older, and the way it pulled in showed confidence. Whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. That ruled out randomness. This was planned. Forensics worked quickly. They recovered shell casings, 9mm rounds, and noted that the shooter had fired with precision. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. "Double tap," one of the ballistics experts said. "That's trained behavior." But when they checked firearm databases, nothing matched. No fingerprints on the casings, no footprints leading away. It was as if the killer had studied crime scenes before, or worse, rehearsed for this one. Carlson felt a chill run through him as he looked at the empty lot once more. He'd seen sociopaths, killers, and gang members. But this felt wrong. It was too methodical, too deliberate. It felt like something, or someone, was playing a game. Meanwhile, news of Officer Thomas Graham's death spread through the department like wildfire. He'd been a quiet man, known for mentoring rookies, known for never cutting corners. His fellow officers were shattered. The department's flag was lowered to half-mast, and a makeshift memorial began to form outside the precinct. Flowers, candles, photographs, letters written in shaky handwriting. Reporters swarmed the area, their microphones pointed like weapons toward anyone in uniform. "Who could have done this?" they asked. "Was this a targeted attack?" Carlson didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know. Back at headquarters, the task force worked around the clock. They combed through every call made that night. When they pulled up the 911 recording, the room fell silent. The voice on the other end of the line was young. Too young. The pitch, the cadence, the hesitation in certain syllables. Carlson felt his gut tighten. "Play that again," he said. They did. The voice trembled just enough to sound believable, but not terrified. It was rehearsed fear, emotion performed, not felt. "That's not an adult," he murmured. "That's a kid." The room went still. No one wanted to believe it. A child's voice tied to the murder of a police officer? It sounded absurd. And yet, something about it clicked deep in Carlson's instincts. He'd seen it before. The arrogance, the calm. Kids trying to prove they were untouchable, but never like this. As the investigation deepened, detectives began canvassing nearby neighborhoods, interviewing residents who lived close to the docks. Most had heard nothing, just the faint echo of gunshots blending with the sound of the highway. But one witness, a night shift security guard working 2 blocks away, mentioned seeing a small car driving off slowly after the shots. "Didn't look like they were in a rush," he said. "That's what's weird. People panic after gunfire. They didn't." He couldn't recall the color or the license plate, but that one detail, the calmness, haunted Carlson. It was a signature. Days turned into weeks. The case dominated headlines. "Who killed Officer Graham?" read one. "City demands justice," read another. Pressure mounted from every direction. The department, the public, the families. But the trail was thin. Too thin. Whoever had done this had left behind almost nothing, which only made Carlson more certain that it wasn't the work of hardened criminals. Professionals leave evidence because they know how to hide it in noise. Amateurs erase everything because they think that makes them invisible. "Kids," he said one night, pacing his office. "It feels like kids." His partner, Detective Morales, frowned. "Kids don't pull off clean hits like this." Carlson looked at the photos spread across the table. The shells, the patterns, the angles. "Maybe not most kids," he said, "but some do." At the same time, the killer, the youngest one at least, was living his life like nothing had changed. Lance went to school. He smiled when spoken to. He turned in his assignments. Teachers praised him for his focus. If anyone noticed that his eyes seemed a little emptier than before, they didn't say so. He even attended Officer Graham's televised memorial with his class, standing quietly as the flag-draped casket was carried out. When his teacher began to cry, Lance tilted his head slightly, watching her face the way one might watch a scene in a movie, not with empathy, but fascination. Later that night, he wrote in his hidden journal, "The world doesn't understand balance. They cry for one man but ignore thousands. Hypocrisy is their weakness." It wasn't remorse. It was analysis. Back in the investigation room, Carlson studied the 911 audio until he could recite every breath, every pause. He had a theory now, one that sounded insane enough to make him hesitate before saying it out loud. What if this wasn't revenge? He asked Morales. What if it was a test? His partner blinked. A test of what? Control, Carlson replied. The person who made that call, They weren't scared. They were experimenting. He didn't know then how close he was to the truth. A week later, the break came from an unexpected source. Digital forensics traced a prepaid phone used to make the 911 call to a gas station security camera. The footage wasn't perfect, but it showed enough. Two teenagers entering the store, one tall, one shorter, their faces partially obscured by hoodies. They bought the phone, paid cash, and left in a small, beat-up sedan. It wasn't much, but it was something. The timestamp matched the activation record almost exactly. When Carlson saw the footage, he didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he leaned back, exhaling. "There it is," he whispered. "They really are kids." The realization sent shockwaves through the department. Even hardened officers who'd seen the worst of humanity struggled to accept it. 13 and 15, one of them muttered in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." But the evidence was solid. Cross-referencing the purchase with local school attendance records, they began to build a list of possible matches. And as the walls closed in, Lance's carefully constructed illusion began to crack. At home, he remained calm. Too calm. But Caleb wasn't built for silence. The guilt, the sleepless nights, the news broadcasts showing Officer Graham's grieving family, it all started to eat at him. He tried to talk to Lance about it once, late at night, his voice trembling. "Do you ever think about what we did?" Lance didn't even look up from his computer. "Thinking about it doesn't change it," he said flatly. "It's done. You can either control the story or become part of someone else's." Caleb stared at him, realizing for the first time that his friend wasn't burdened by what they'd done. He was proud of it. That realization terrified him. And yet, despite everything, they still met in secret. Still planned what Lance called Phase 2. He wanted to do it again, to prove consistency, as he wrote in his notes. But this time the world was already watching. The investigation was closing in. Every call, every camera, every trace was being pulled apart by detectives who refused to let the city's grief go unanswered. The echoes in the warehouse never truly faded. Each one carried a piece of the night, a sound, a shadow, a question that wouldn't rest. To the investigators, those echoes became a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always come with warning signs or motives that make sense. Sometimes it comes wearing a school uniform. Sometimes it walks among the living with the calm of the dead. And for Detective Stephen Carlson, standing in that warehouse weeks later, he realized the truth in a way that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in darkness. They're the ones who learn how to live in the light. In the weeks that followed, San Diego began to breathe again, or at least tried to. The shock of Officer Graham's death had dulled just enough for people to resume their routines, though the wound it left still lingered beneath the surface. Patrol cars passed a little slower through neighborhoods. Police radios stayed busier, more alert. Parents who once waved casually from driveways now locked their doors before sunset. The illusion of safety, that invisible contract between the city and those sworn to protect it, had been broken, and no one quite knew how to repair it. Yet amid all the unease, two boys still walked among them, invisible, ordinary, their faces unremarkable in the crowd. It should have been impossible, a child carrying a secret heavy enough to split a man in two, yet still managing to smile at teachers and sit through math tests. But for Lance Thompson, invisibility wasn't a disguise anymore. It was his nature. For Caleb Foster, however, the illusion was cracking. The nights were the worst. He'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, the same image replaying in his mind. Not the act itself, but the sound afterward, that echo of silence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Sleep refused to come, and when it did, it came in fragments, flickers of red and blue light, the faint hum of a police radio, the cold flash of something irreversible. He tried drowning it out with music, with video games, with noise, anything to fill the quiet. But the quiet always came back. It always found him. During the day, he felt it in his chest, a tightening, a restlessness he couldn't name. And the more he tried to act normal, the more unnatural it felt. Every question from a teacher sounded like suspicion. Every police siren in the distance made his pulse quicken. He began avoiding eye contact with everyone, even Lance. Especially Lance. Lance, on the other hand, seemed immune to guilt. If anything, he'd grown calmer, more composed. There was a strange brightness in him now. Not happiness exactly, but a sharpness, as if something inside him had crystallized. He carried himself differently, spoke more deliberately. When he looked at people, it was as though he were studying them, observing the subtle tics and tremors that most eyes would miss. He took notes again, filling pages in his secret journal with reflections that blurred the line between philosophy and pathology. People are machines, he wrote. Predictable inputs, predictable outcomes. Guilt is just another program error. His handwriting was immaculate, even controlled, almost beautiful. That control was everything to him. While Caleb unraveled, Lance was refining, but even perfection leaves traces. At school, one of their classmates, a quiet girl named Mia, noticed something odd. Caleb had started skipping lunch, spending more time alone, staring off into space. Once, she saw him flinch when a police car passed the school gates, even though its siren wasn't on. When she asked if he was okay, he snapped at her, then immediately apologized. The next day, he avoided her entirely. Teenagers notice things adults don't, the micro shifts, the strange silences. Mia didn't know what was wrong, but something in her gut told her it was more than teenage moodiness. Meanwhile, the investigation had found its rhythm. Detective Stephen Carlson was back in the warehouse, not because he expected new evidence, but because he couldn't stay away. The place haunted him. The smell of oil, the echo of footsteps, the sense that the walls had seen more than anyone realized. Every time he stood there, he could almost feel it, the energy of that night, the precision, the stillness. "You don't get this from rage," he told Morales. "This came from calculation." Morales frowned. "You really think it was kids?" Carlson didn't answer. He didn't have proof yet, just instinct, sharpened by years of seeing how arrogance leaves fingerprints even when the hands are small. Then came the break. A digital forensics specialist had been quietly tracing prepaid phone activations in the weeks before the murder, cross-referencing them with known stores and purchase times. One number matched the 911 call. The timestamp placed the purchase at a gas station just 4 miles from the scene. The same footage Carlson had already studied. But this time, the analyst enhanced the video. A reflection in the store window revealed something missed before, a partial image of one boy's face caught in the glare of a passing car. It wasn't crystal clear, but it was young. Too young. Carlson froze when he saw it. The angle, the posture, the proportions. This wasn't a professional hitman. This was a child. They began cross-referencing school attendance records, focusing on students who lived near the area. That's when Lance Thompson's name surfaced. Not because of any direct evidence, but because of his digital footprint. Subtle, but telling. His online activity showed late-night logins to forums discussing law enforcement response patterns and crime scene analysis. Nothing explicitly incriminating, but odd for a 13-year-old. When Carlson read through the report, his stomach knotted. "Get me a warrant for his devices," he said. Across town, Lance was sitting at his desk, scrolling through his computer as if nothing in the world could touch him. He had no idea that his illusion of control, his quiet empire of detachment, was beginning to crumble at the edges. He noticed Caleb's anxiety growing, of course. He even found it fascinating. "You're falling apart," he told him once, almost tenderly, as if speaking to a sick animal. "That's the difference between us. You feel, I think." Caleb looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time saw what everyone else had missed, that behind Lance's calm smile there was nothing. No remorse, no fear, no empathy. Just a void. That realization left Caleb cold. He began avoiding their late-night meetings, ignoring Lance's texts, trying to convince himself it would all go away if he just stayed quiet. But silence has a way of amplifying guilt. When the detectives arrived at Lance's house days later with a warrant, the Thompson family's world shattered in an instant. The officers were polite, professional, even gentle. After all, they were walking into the home of a middle schooler. Lance's parents watched in stunned disbelief as agents carried out hard drives, notebooks, and a desktop computer. They kept asking what was going on, but the detectives couldn't answer yet. Not until they knew for sure. That night, Carlson sat in the digital lab as technicians began unpacking the data. What they found stopped the room cold, a hidden folder, encrypted but not expertly enough to resist long. Inside were dozens of files, screenshots, notes, images, and a document labeled Observation Log. Each entry was meticulous. Each one dissected human behavior like an anatomy lesson. And in the middle of it all was a file marked simply, Experiment Number 1. Carlson didn't open it right away. He just sat there, staring at the name. He already knew what it was. The proof wasn't in the file. It was in the handwriting of arrogance, in the time-stamped confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. When he finally did open it, the room went silent. There, in cold, careful language, was the blueprint of the crime. Every step mapped, every response anticipated. It wasn't written like a confession. It was written like a report. A child's grammar, an adult's detachment. Back at home, Lance sat at the dinner table, eating quietly while his mother tried to pretend everything was normal. She asked him about school. He answered politely. But something in her tone had changed. A mother always knows when something is off. "They said the police were asking about you," she said softly. Lance looked up, his expression unreadable. "They ask about everyone," he replied, his voice calm, almost soothing. "They have to." She nodded, but her hands were trembling. The next morning, police cars rolled up to his street again. This time, it wasn't for a warrant. It was for him. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as a 13-year-old boy, quiet, polite, unremarkable, was led into the back of a squad car. His parents stood frozen in the driveway, the weight of disbelief too heavy for words. Lance didn't cry. He didn't struggle. He simply looked out the window as the car pulled away, watching the world pass by as though he were seeing it from behind glass, detached, almost curious. Caleb was arrested the same day. When confronted with the evidence, he broke within minutes. His confession spilled out in fragments. Guilt, fear, regret. He told them everything. About Lance, about the plan, about the voice on the phone. Each word he spoke made the silence in the room grow heavier. When Carlson asked him why he went along with it, Caleb whispered, "Because he made me believe nothing mattered. And for a while, I wanted to believe that too." That was the moment it all crystallized for Detective Carlson. The core of the case, the truth that lay beneath every horror. Evil doesn't always arrive in rage or hatred. Sometimes it slips quietly into the mind of a child who mistakes emptiness for power. The cracks had begun to show long before the night of the murder, but no one looked closely enough to see them. And as Lance Thompson sat in a sterile interrogation room, his face calm, his voice steady, the detective across from him couldn't help but feel a cold shiver run down his spine. He wasn't looking at a monster from the movies. He was looking at something far more unsettling. A child who had looked at the world, found it wanting, and decided to rewrite its rules. The room was small, square, and deliberately unremarkable. Pale gray walls, a single table, 2 chairs, one flickering fluorescent light that hummed faintly, as though even it felt uneasy about what was about to unfold. Detective Stephen Carlson stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, studying the boy seated across the table. 13. Thin, pale, hair neatly combed as if this were an ordinary school day. His hands rested quietly in his lap, fingers interlaced, posture straight. No slouching, no fidgeting. Just stillness. It was the kind of composure that would have impressed a teacher, but here, in this room, it felt wrong. Carlson had interrogated men twice his age who couldn't sit that calmly under fluorescent light. He sat down without speaking. The air between them was heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of everything that had already been discovered. The encrypted files, the journals, the voice analysis, Caleb's confession. But Carlson didn't open the folder yet. He wanted to see the boy's eyes first. When he finally spoke, his tone was gentle, almost fatherly. "You know why you're here, Lance." The boy nodded once, his gaze steady. "Yes, sir." His voice was soft, polite, unsettlingly even. No tremor, no hesitation. Carlson had expected defiance, maybe tears, maybe panic. He found none. "We've spoken to Caleb," he said carefully. "He's told us a lot." Lance blinked, expression unreadable. "He talks too much," he said simply. Carlson leaned forward slightly. "You two planned this together, didn't you?" For a long moment, Lance said nothing. Then he looked up, meeting the detective's eyes with an eerie calm. "Planned?" he repeated. "I prefer the word designed." The word hung in the air like smoke. Designed. Carlson felt a chill crawl down his neck. There was no boast in the boy's tone, no thrill of rebellion, only the cool precision of someone explaining an equation. He opened the file, sliding a photograph across the table. "Do you understand what this means, Lance? A man is dead. His family's grieving. People trusted you." The boy glanced at the photo, his eyes pausing only briefly before drifting away, as if he were looking at a page in a history book, rather than something he'd lived. "People die every day," he said quietly. "They just don't get news coverage." The detective took a slow breath. He'd been trained to recognize manipulation, to see when someone was pushing for control. But this was different. It wasn't performance. It was vacancy. "You're a smart kid," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Smarter than most adults I talk to, so tell me something. Why?" Lance tilted his head slightly, considering. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then he said, "Because I wanted to see what would happen." The simplicity of the answer was like a knife, clean, precise, merciless. Carlson felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He'd dealt with motives before, greed, rage, jealousy. But curiosity, that was harder to grasp, harder to fight. He tried again, his tone softer now. "You could have done anything with that intelligence. Why choose this?" Lance's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because intelligence doesn't matter if you can't prove it means anything. Everyone pretends life has rules, but it doesn't. I just stopped pretending." He said it without malice, as if describing a law of physics. Carlson studied him, the precise diction, the detached confidence, the absence of emotional rhythm in his voice. There was nothing adolescent about him except the size of his hands. For a while, neither spoke. The clock ticked softly, marking each second like a pulse. Then Carlson leaned forward, his voice low. "You think this makes you powerful, don't you? You think because you're young, you can't be touched." Lance's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something faint. Amusement, maybe. "It's not about power," he said. "It's about understanding who really has it." He gestured toward the mirror on the wall, knowing full well there were officers watching behind it. "They think they do. But they can't control what people think of me. Not anymore." The detective felt the temperature of the room drop, though he knew it hadn't. This wasn't arrogance, it was ideology. The boy wasn't trying to escape blame, he was analyzing it, dissecting it like another experiment. Carlson shifted tactics. "Do you feel sorry, Lance?" he asked quietly. The boy's eyes flicked toward him again, and for the first time, there was a pause, small but noticeable. He seemed to search for the correct response, not the honest one. "I understand why I'm supposed to," he finally said, "but I don't." Carlson sat back, exhaling slowly. That was it. The confirmation of what he'd already suspected. The emptiness wasn't an act. It was genuine. He closed the file and let the silence hang between them again. Then he said softly, almost to himself, "You're 13 years old." Lance nodded once. "Age doesn't decide awareness," he replied. "It just limits it." There was something haunting in the way he said it. An echo of the forums, the rhetoric he'd absorbed online, twisted into philosophy. Through the glass, the observing officers shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads, others whispered under their breath. To see that level of composure in a child felt wrong on a primal level. Carlson kept his eyes on him, trying to find even a flicker of humanity to hold on to. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think you built a wall so high you forgot what it's like to be human, but walls crack, Lance, they always do." For the first time, a shadow of something crossed the boy's face. Not emotion exactly, but irritation. "Maybe," he said softly. "But people like you spend your lives trying to fix cracks. People like me learn how to live inside them." Carlson knew then that this conversation wasn't about confession. It was about comprehension. The boy didn't deny anything because denial would imply guilt, and guilt required empathy. What Lance sought was acknowledgement, a record that he had existed on his own terms, even if those terms defied everything human about the world around him. Hours later, as the door finally opened and officers escorted Lance from the room, Carlson remained seated. The echo of the boy's words still hung in the air, quieter now, but no less heavy. He stared at the empty chair, realizing that what unsettled him most wasn't what the child had done, but how ordinary he looked doing it. Evil, he thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, in the calm voice of a child who believes he's smarter than consequence. Outside, the hallway buzzed with murmurs, paperwork, and fatigue. Carlson walked past the noise without hearing it. The case was closing, but something in him had cracked too, a small fracture of understanding that would never quite mend. Because after that day, he knew that the line between innocence and darkness wasn't drawn by age or circumstance, it was drawn by choice, and Lance Thompson had chosen. The courthouse sat on a hill overlooking the city, a structure of glass and steel that gleamed under the Californian sun, as if daring anyone to question the purity of justice within. Yet, on the morning the trial began, it didn't feel like a temple of order. It felt like a theater. Reporters lined the steps before dawn, microphones poised, camera lights cutting through the early mist. Every news channel had turned the story into spectacle, the boy who broke San Diego. Headlines pulsed across televisions, podcasts dissected the psychology, talk shows debated the law. "What does it mean?" the public demanded, "when a child commits something no child should understand? Was it evil or illness? Failure of parenting? Or failure of the system?" And beneath every question lurked a deeper one that no one dared say out loud. Could it happen again? Inside, the air was thick with quiet tension. The courtroom wasn't built for this kind of case. Juvenile trials were supposed to be closed, contained, whispers behind doors, lessons for reform. But this case had outgrown the walls meant to contain it. Judges, lawyers, officers, and psychologists crowded the space, each one carrying their own private disbelief. At the defense table sat the boy at the center of it all, small, pale, impeccably calm. His hands were folded neatly on the table, his eyes lowered as if studying the pattern of the wood grain. To look at him was to feel disoriented. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a student waiting for his turn to speak. But the silence that surrounded him carried an invisible gravity. The awareness that he had crossed a line no one imagined possible at his age. When the judge entered, the murmurs fell away. The boy's parents were seated a few rows back, their faces hollowed by disbelief and exhaustion. His mother's hands clutched a crumpled tissue that never seemed to leave her grasp. His father stared forward, jaw set, as though holding himself together by sheer will. They hadn't spoken much since the arrest. Grief had drawn invisible borders around them, the grief not only of losing their child to the system, but of realizing they had never truly known him. The prosecution began its opening statement with restraint, but even restraint could not soften the edges of the truth. They spoke of meticulous planning, of manipulation, of a mind that calculated cause and effect without conscience. They didn't use the word monster. They didn't have to. The defense took a different approach. They painted a picture of fragility, a boy isolated, misguided, shaped by forces he couldn't comprehend. They spoke of his intellect like a curse, of his detachment as a form of unhealed loneliness. Their words carried the weight of compassion, but also of uncertainty. How do you defend someone whose eyes reflect nothing back? The psychologists brought in to evaluate him struggled too. Some described him as a prodigy detached from morality. Others called him a child lost in abstraction, someone who understood emotion conceptually, but not viscerally. There were hours of testimony, of speculation, of argument, all circling the same unanswerable question. What happens when a human being feels nothing, not even remorse? Detective Stephen Carlson sat near the back through most of it, silent, his face unreadable. He had told himself he wouldn't come, but curiosity and duty had pulled him back. Watching the boy sit there, so composed, so small beneath the shadow of the law, he felt the same mixture of sorrow and anger he'd felt in the interrogation room. Not anger at what the boy had done, that part had already burned itself out, but anger at the emptiness, the total lack of recognition in those eyes. Carlson had spent his career believing that every crime, no matter how cruel, carried a fragment of humanity in it, a moment of regret, a flicker of shame. But this case had erased that comfort. It had forced him to stare directly into a version of humanity that had nothing left inside. Outside the courthouse, the world debated. Protesters held signs demanding harsher punishment, while others pleaded for compassion, arguing that the boy was a product of neglect, not malice. News anchors used phrases like the death of innocence and a generation without empathy. Psychologists gave interviews about the dangers of desensitization, about the internet's hidden influence on developing minds. Everyone had an opinion, no one had an answer. And in the middle of it all, the boy sat behind glass, listening to people dissect his soul as if it were a science project. If he felt anything about it, no one could tell. As the trial went on, the rhythm of the courtroom began to feel surreal. Experts speaking clinically about morality, lawyers performing empathy like ritual, reporters whispering judgments into microphones. It was less a pursuit of truth and more a reflection of fear. Fear of what the case implied about the rest of us. Because if a child could be capable of such detachment, what did that say about the world that raised him? About the screens, the isolation, the quiet erosion of empathy that had crept into modern life? People wanted to believe he was an anomaly. But the deeper everyone looked, the harder it became to draw that line. On the final day of testimony, a psychologist took the stand, an older man, calm and deliberate. He had spent weeks evaluating the boy and now spoke softly, as though addressing the entire city through the courtroom walls. "This child," he said, did not wake up one day and decide to destroy life. He grew in silence, unseen. We don't notice emotional emptiness because it doesn't make noise. It doesn't act out. It withdraws. It observes. Until one day it acts, not out of anger, but out of detachment. His words fell into the still air like stones into deep water. Even the boy glanced up just for a moment as if curious to hear himself defined. When the final arguments ended, the courtroom seemed to exhale as one. The boy was escorted out, still calm, still wordless. His parents followed, their faces pale, moving as if underwater. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but the family didn't respond. Carlson watched from the steps as they disappeared into the swarm of microphones and speculation. For the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not closure, but fatigue. Because no verdict, no sentence, no legal definition of guilt could undo what had been revealed. It wasn't just a crime. It was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when empathy erodes quietly in the shadows of ordinary life. That evening, as the sun set over the bay, the city glowed in gold and sorrow. The water shimmered like glass, reflecting a sky that looked almost too peaceful for what the world had witnessed. Carlson stood by the harbor, watching the light fade, thinking about the boy's last words in the interrogation room, about walls and cracks, and who learns to live inside them. He didn't know if the world could fix those cracks anymore. But he knew this. Silence was the most dangerous place for darkness to grow, and somewhere even now, other children were scrolling through the same endless screens, searching for meaning in a world that rarely looked back at them. The trial had ended. But the question it asked would echo far longer than the verdict. Months passed before the city began to sound normal again. The sirens no longer carried that note of panic. Traffic lights blinked through their ordinary rhythm. The harbor gulls cried above the tide as if nothing had changed. But under the surface, San Diego had grown quieter. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that follows a question nobody can answer. The warehouse district was cleaned and reopened, yet few people drove there anymore. Families who once parked along the bay for sunsets now chose different streets, as if distance could soften memory. The story of the boy had drifted from the headlines into that strange category of events people half remember but never fully forget. Detective Stephen Carlson still carried the case with him. It followed him in small, unexpected ways: a song on the radio, the sight of a child biking alone, the sound of his own son's laughter at dinner. Those moments always came with a flicker of unease, a silent question. How do you teach goodness in a world that can hide so much emptiness behind a smile? Some nights he would walk down to the pier after shift, watching the water change color beneath the city lights, and think about the boy's calm voice in that gray interrogation room. He had stopped looking for closure. There was none. Instead, he looked for meaning. Thin strands of understanding that might keep other kids from slipping through the cracks the way that one had. The boy's parents had moved away from the neighborhood. The house was sold quietly, its rooms repainted, its yard replanted with flowers that grew too quickly in the mild coastal air. The new family never knew the history. For them, it was simply a good school district and a pleasant street. The neighbors rarely mentioned the Thompsons anymore. People learned that forgetting was easier when the memory lived next door. But sometimes, late in the evening, when porch lights flickered on and the ocean breeze rolled inland, someone would glance at that house and feel a faint chill. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of how fragile the ordinary can be. Caleb Foster's story faded more gently. In the juvenile facility, he began to talk again. Not about the night itself, but about everything around it. The boredom, the loneliness, the strange comfort of someone finally paying attention. Therapists said he was learning to feel remorse in real time, which was messy and painful. He started writing letters he couldn't send, one of them addressed to Officer Graham's family, another to Lance, though that one remained unfinished. He was beginning, in fits and starts, to understand the difference between explanation and excuse. His progress was slow, uncertain, but it existed. Proof that guilt, for all its cruelty, can sometimes become a form of grace. The community, too, had changed. Schools introduced new counseling programs, not because of policy, but because teachers refused to let silence win again. Parents began to ask harder questions, not about grades or achievements, but about feelings, about loneliness, about what their children saw and believed when no one was watching. For a while, there was cynicism, people insisting that nothing truly changes, that tragedies fade as quickly as news cycles. But change doesn't always arrive as law or reform. Sometimes it's quieter, a conversation held instead of ignored, a phone put down before dinner, a moment of eye contact that lingers a little longer. The city hadn't healed completely, but it had started to listen. One gray afternoon, almost a year after the trial, Carlson returned to the warehouse alone. The lot was empty now, paved over, the air smelling faintly of rust and rain. The building itself was scheduled for demolition, but he wanted to see it once more before it vanished. Standing there, he felt the echoes again, not of violence, but of time, of memory folding in on itself. He realized he no longer saw it as a crime scene. It was a reminder that darkness doesn't always roar into the world. Sometimes it drifts in quietly, carried by isolation, unnoticed until it's too late. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the metal walls. And then he did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not for punishment, not even for peace, but for awareness. That people would keep seeing, keep asking, keep caring. When he finally walked away, the sun was breaking through the clouds, thin rays cutting across the asphalt. The city stretched before him, vast and imperfect, alive in all its contradictions. There were children playing in the distance, their laughter rising above the hum of traffic. It sounded ordinary, and for the first time in months, that word didn't feel fragile. It felt like hope, quiet, tentative, but real. Because life always returns, even to the places that thought they'd forgotten how to breathe. Years passed, and the story that once consumed every headline became another folded page in the city's long history. Something referenced in whispers, remembered through caution, not conversation. Time, in its strange mercy, had softened the sharp edges of what happened, but it had not erased them. It never does. Memory, like the ocean that brushed San Diego's shorelines, doesn't vanish. It recedes, gathers strength, and returns when the tide is right. The people who had lived through that year learned this truth in their own ways, quietly, privately, through the small, ordinary moments that life kept insisting upon. Detective Stephen Carlson was nearing retirement when he began writing again. Not reports, not statements, but reflections. He filled old notebooks with thoughts about justice, empathy, and the fragile architecture of childhood. Sometimes he wrote in his study late into the night, the same desk lamp glowing against stacks of unsolved cases and old photographs. The younger officers often joked that he was the last of the old guard, still carrying a notepad instead of a tablet, still believing that understanding a crime required understanding the human heart. They didn't know that his obsession with empathy wasn't professional anymore. It was personal. He couldn't forget that interrogation room, that steady child's voice explaining detachment as if it were a subject learned in school. He wrote to make sense of it, to wrestle with the unease that never left. Over time, his words began to sound less like questions and more like prayers. In the years that followed, the warehouse district transformed. The old lot was cleared, and in its place rose a community center. Bright walls, murals painted by local artists, laughter spilling through open windows. Children played basketball on the same ground that had once carried silence and sirens. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Carlson. When he visited the site for its opening ceremony, the smell of fresh paint and cut grass replaced the ghostly echoes that had haunted him for years. Standing there among parents and kids, he realized how memory changes shape. It doesn't always remain a wound. Sometimes it becomes a reminder to build better, to love louder. The city hadn't forgotten. It had simply learned to remember differently. Caleb Foster's path was slower, uneven, but real. He spent years in rehabilitation and education programs, and though progress came in fragments, it came nonetheless. Counselors described him as quiet, disciplined, deeply remorseful. He avoided interviews and never sought sympathy. What he wanted, it seemed, was distance, from the event, from his old self, from the noise of a world that once fueled his numbness. Eventually, he earned a degree in psychology, specializing in youth behavioral development. The irony of that wasn't lost on him either. He never spoke publicly about the past, but when he mentored at-risk teens, his advice carried a weight no classroom could teach. "Don't let emptiness fool you into thinking it's strength," he would say softly. "It's not strength, it's just silence." Those words became his quiet redemption, spoken not from guilt anymore, but from understanding. As for the boy at the center of it all, the one who had turned the city inside out, time reduced him to an idea rather than a person. Laws sealed his name from public record, and his fate faded into legal anonymity. Some said he was transferred to a long-term facility, others believed he disappeared into another state system. The truth became irrelevant. What mattered was the lesson his existence had forced everyone to face. Teachers began to notice the quiet kids a little more. Parents started to listen beyond words. The invisible ones, the ones who smiled just enough to blend in, people saw them now. Not with suspicion, but with care. That was the city's unspoken promise to itself, that silence would no longer go unnoticed. Carlson eventually retired and moved north to a small coastal town where the ocean was louder and the nights darker. He lived simply. Long walks, old books, coffee in the same cafe every morning. But even there, the past found him sometimes. Not as nightmares anymore, but as quiet reminders. A child laughing too loudly in a grocery store, a siren wailing distantly on a foggy evening, the smell of rain on asphalt. Each moment tugged at memory's edge. He never tried to push them away. He understood now that remembering was part of healing. Forgetting wasn't peace, it was erasure. And erasure was how darkness returned. On the 10th anniversary of the case, the city held a small memorial. No speeches, no cameras, just a handful of people gathered by the water. Police officers, community members, a few families who had lived through the storm. A plaque was unveiled near the community center, its inscription simple: "For those lost to silence, for those who learned to listen." Carlson stood among the crowd, hat in hand, feeling the sun warm his shoulders. The wind off the ocean carried the scent of salt and wild sage, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the familiar ache in his chest. Instead, he felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the persistence of hope that had somehow survived it. He thought about the faces he'd seen, the voices he'd heard, the lessons carved out of grief. Humanity, he realized, was not measured by the darkness it encounters, but by the light it insists on bringing back. As the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind the quiet hum of waves against the pier. Carlson lingered a while longer, watching the horizon bleed into gold. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing. The same sound that once felt like a fragile illusion now felt like a promise. The city had moved on, but it had not forgotten. Memory remained, softer now, like a stone worn smooth by years of water. Heavy, yes, but no longer sharp. Because the weight of memory, he had learned, is not meant to crush. It's meant to keep us human. Time has a way of softening everything, even the memories that once cut deepest. Years after the city's darkest chapter, the scars no longer dictated the rhythm of daily life. They had become part of its landscape, invisible to most, but present in the quiet, in the way people listened more carefully, in the way they looked one another in the eye a little longer. The world had moved forward, but not blindly. The silence that once swallowed the community had been replaced by conversation, by awareness, by the slow, patient rebuilding of trust. In that rebuilding, there was a kind of beauty, the fragile kind that only grows out of pain. The community center built on the old warehouse site had long since become the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Its bright walls, painted with murals of sunlight, ocean waves, and open hands, seemed to breathe life into the air around it. On any given afternoon, the sound of basketballs echoed across the lot, laughter spilling over like a second language of joy. Children chased each other across the same ground that once held sorrow, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet, or maybe not unaware, just unburdened by them. The building's name, The Haven, was chosen by local students. It wasn't meant to erase the past, but to honor it, to remind the city that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about reclaiming the spaces that fear once occupied. Detective Stephen Carlson, now long retired, visited every year on the same day, not out of duty, but habit. He would sit quietly on a bench near the mural of the rising sun, a cup of coffee in his hands, and watch the children play. Sometimes they'd wave to him, mistaking him for a kindly old volunteer. He always waved back, smiling faintly, saying nothing of who he once was or what had brought him there. In his silence, he found peace. There was something comforting in the simplicity of it. The idea that the world could move on, that innocence could return in the laughter of those who had no reason to doubt it. He'd spent a lifetime looking for darkness. Now, he'd learned to recognize the light. He'd kept in touch with a few people from those years, a counselor from the rehabilitation program, a former journalist who'd covered the trial but later left the industry to teach media ethics, and occasionally, the mayor who had once sworn that the city would not let tragedy define it. Every year they exchanged brief messages, simple updates, small victories, a new scholarship fund, a mentorship program, a youth art exhibit. They were small things, yes, but they mattered. They were proof that healing, real healing, doesn't come from sweeping gestures or headlines. It comes from the quiet persistence of kindness repeated over time. In his later years, Carlson began writing again, not about crime this time, but about empathy. His essays were collected by a small local publisher under the title The Shape of Silence. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found readers, teachers, parents, social workers, people searching for meaning in their own work. One passage was often quoted, "Light doesn't return all at once. It seeps in slowly, through the cracks we thought would never heal. You notice it not because it blinds you, but because it feels warm again." When asked what inspired that line, he simply smiled and said, "A city that learned how to listen." The years continued to roll forward, and San Diego, though changed, thrived. New generations grew up unaware of the details of the story that had once shaken their city. They didn't need to know every fact. They only needed to inherit the lesson. Teachers taught empathy not as a subject, but as a skill. Parents listened with more patience. The police department, once haunted by the loss of one of their own, became advocates for community engagement and mental health outreach. The city had not erased its history. It had evolved from it. On a warm evening near the end of summer, the community center held a festival to celebrate its 20th anniversary. Lanterns hung from trees, live music floated through the air, and families gathered under the soft glow of string lights. Carlson, older now, his hair turned silver and his steps slower, attended with his grandchildren. He didn't tell them why the event meant so much to him. He simply watched them dance under the lights, their laughter rising above the music. For a moment, time folded in on itself, the past and the present touching like two waves meeting at shore. As the night deepened, the lanterns were released into the sky one by one, small flickering orbs drifting upward, reflecting in the bay below. Each carried a handwritten message from someone in the community. Words of gratitude, remembrance, forgiveness. Carlson's lantern carried no message at all. He simply watched it rise, carried by the wind, until it disappeared into the dark. And when it was gone, he whispered to no one in particular, "It's enough." Because it was. The city had found its balance again. Not perfect, not untouched, but whole in the way that only those who've known loss can be. The light had returned, not as a flood, but as a steady dawn. Quiet, persistent, human. Years later, the story lived on only in memory and murals, fragments of a time when the city learned how fragile innocence can be and how resilient compassion truly is. Somewhere, a teacher began a lesson about empathy. Somewhere else, a parent put down their phone and asked their child how they were feeling, and listened. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change the next story before it ever began. Because in the end, the light always returns. Not all at once, not perfectly, but always.